So we've been talking about derivatives as freestanding instruments. Well, the problem is derivatives can be in a lot of different places, especially if you are dealing with long-term contracts. And we think about some of the long-term contracts you learned about last semester. Those could be bond contracts or long-term debt contracts, lease contracts. We can even start thinking about things in insurance contracts or long-term financial guarantees. We can also look at maybe some, if we go back to your very first course in financial reporting, some long-term contracts for doing maybe construction, etc. There's possible that there could be embedded derivatives, options, forwards, probably not futures, but definitely maybe a forward, and swaps of different kinds that might be in these contracts. In literature, we'll go over here to our broad transactions, and under derivatives and hedging, there's a whole section on what we call embedded derivatives. Now we know that the accounting for embedded derivatives, or for the accounting for derivatives is fair value, changes in fair value go through the income statement. So if I have a derivative that is embedded in another host instrument, we'll call this a hybrid instrument. Then we have to, and the hybrid instrument, or maybe it's a debt instrument or a lease, we're always going to default to the way we would normally account for the debt instrument or the lease, but we still have to figure out, should we be accounting for this derivative that's embedded in the debt agreement or the lease agreement or the insurance contract? Do we need to pull out that piece of the contract and account for it at fair value? Changes in fair value go through the income statement. So let's go over here and just take a look at the literature on embedded derivatives. And I want to immediately go to the recognition criterion, because this is what we're going to pay close attention to. So when we go to 25-1, this is the rules we've got to go through. This is kind of the process you have to look at. So I'm just going to read it to you because it's here. The embedded derivative shall be separated. So if you have a derivative in a host contract, it has to be separated from the host contract and accounted for as a derivative if and only if all of the following criteria are met. So these three things have to exist. If any one of them doesn't exist, or we're doing something, then we can account for the host instrument and the embedded derivative the way you would normally account for the host instrument, right? However you're accounting for the host instrument. So these are the three things you've got to go through. The economic characteristics and risks of the embedded derivative are not clearly and closely related to the economic characteristics and risks of the host contract. So we'll talk a little bit more about clearly and closely related. But imagine you have a debt instrument that's related to interest rates, and there is a cap on your interest rate. Maybe it's a variable rate loan, and there's a cap that every year the maximum that the interest can go up or down is 1%. So you've got a cap of 1% and you've got a floor of 1%. We call that a collar, a cap and a floor combined. If that cap is based on anything other than a basic index, and I'm talking about an interest rate index, then it's not clearly and closely related. So we'll give some examples of going through this process of splitting it out. The second one, the hybrid instrument is not measured at fair value. So if we do not take the fair value option of accounting for a financial instrument for this hybrid instrument, because you have that option, you learned that in the previous courses. You have the choice to select a contract and take the fair value measurement. You can account for this stuff at fair value, but you have to make that distinction right away. You see that a lot with debt instruments. If you are not measuring it at fair value, then the item has to be pulled out of the embedded derivative has to be pulled out of the host instrument. Remember, all three of these things have to be met. And then the last one, a separate instrument with the same kind of terms as the embedded instrument would be considered a derivative. So another way of wording this is, if this embedded derivative, could this embedded derivative be a freestanding derivative? Could I go out and buy a cap? Could I go out and buy a floor separately from this particular item being in the host instrument? If all three of these things are met, it's not clearly and closely related, we're not at fair value, and it would be a freestanding instrument, then you have to what we call bifurcate, split between the host instrument and the derivative. We'll talk a little bit more about how to designate how you get to clearly and closely related a little bit later on. But these are the three things that we've got to go through. And if you've ever had, if any of you have applied for a mortgage and you looked at adjustable rate mortgages have caps and floors built into it. Not only annual caps and floors, but also lifetime caps and floors. Those things are in there to reduce the risk for you as the borrower.